You might say tipping is getting a little out of hand these days. So is it any different in Mexico? If you're traveling to Mexico, I'm gonna share everything you need to know about tipping. Everyone's favorite topic. In this video, I'm covering who you should tip, how much, and in what currency, as well as a few things to consider and certain scenarios where there are exceptions to the rules, so to speak. Also, I'm covering information for both all-inclusive resorts and if you're just doing your own independent travel. First, how much should you tip? Well, the answer is, it depends. 10% is your baseline standard tip, and I would say 12 to 15% if you feel like you received great service. Of course, you're welcome to tip more at your discretion. It also depends what type of service you're tipping on. So to make it easier, let's go over some scenarios of where it's courteous to provide a tip. For servers at a sit-down restaurant, 10 to 15% is pretty common. Since it's a cash economy, if you're paying with a credit card, that's fine. But if I'm using a credit card to pay for a meal, I always use cash to tip the servers instead of adding it onto the bill. Also, make sure to check your receipt. If you see that a tip or gratuity has already been added to your bill before you pay, this is actually illegal in Mexico, and it violates a federal law. So you can ask to have this removed. Sometimes it's hidden or labeled as a service fee. This doesn't happen very often, but if you're in a really touristy area of Mexico, I would keep an eye out for this. If you're eating street food or at a taco stand, they usually have a tip jar, so it's courteous to throw in $1 or $2 per order. Moving on to taxis. Now, I usually don't tip taxis because the price is agreed upon before getting into the vehicle, and for tourists, it's usually an already inflated price. However, if you feel like they went above and beyond, like helping you with your bags, or maybe they provided helpful tips and information, of course, you're welcome to tip if you feel inclined. I do tip my Uber drivers, however, as they usually get paid much less than what the actual Uber fare costs. Housekeeping and cleaning staff. Definitely tip these people. I usually leave 50 pesos per day, but 30 to 40 pesos would also be acceptable. I would say this number also depends on how tidy or messy your room is. If it's a disaster, please tip a lot more than that. Some people also choose to leave a little extra on the last day. I wouldn't recommend saving your tip until the very last day though, because it might be a different cleaner than the previous days. If you're staying in a hotel that has turn-down service, usually a small tip is appreciated for that. A note on mini bars. If you're staying at an all-inclusive resort that comes with a mini fridge with some stocked items like soft drinks, a few beers, maybe some snacks, these are actually usually stocked by a different staff member, not the housekeeping staff. So if I utilize the items from the mini bar, usually I leave a tip, somewhere between 20 and 30 pesos. Tour guides. How much to tip your tour guide depends on the tour. I tip on everything from a free walking tour to a full 10-hour day trip tour. On average, for something like that, you could tip about 10% of the tour cost. For something like a free walking tour, it really depends how long the tour was, and I would say how much value you think you received from it. I also wanted to touch on grocery stores. So if you're staying at an Airbnb type of accommodation, or somewhere with a kitchen and plan to buy groceries, at most major supermarkets, the people who bag the groceries are not paid by the store. They rely on tips. So I usually keep a few pesos around for these people. Now let's go into a little more detail about tipping at an all-inclusive resort. Many all-inclusive resort packages include gratuities. If this is the case, I still usually tip individual staff. While a percentage of that gratuity you're being charged does go into the employee's hands, you never really know how much of it they actually see. And chances are, it's a lot lower than you would think. Wages at all-inclusive resorts are shockingly low, and therefore many of the staff do rely on tips to make a decent living. While you're not required to tip at all-inclusive resorts, in my experience, you get much better service when you do. At most places, you'll see higher quality service, and the staff will go out of their way to make sure you have everything you need. Plus, they always work so hard and they're so friendly, so it's a really nice way to thank them. Generally speaking, there aren't really any prices listed anywhere at all-inclusive resorts, so here are some guidelines to follow as far as how much to tip. For sit-down meals at all-inclusives, breakfast is usually a buffet style, so plan to tip around 50 pesos. Lunch can be about the same or maybe slightly higher. And as for dinner at a sit-down or a la carte restaurant, 100 to 200 pesos is customary. For bartenders at the pool and pool servers, usually $1 or $2 per round of drinks is acceptable. Unless they're complex drinks, maybe a little more. What I do and what I see a lot of people do is tip the server or bartender at the beginning of the day, maybe 100 to 200 pesos, and that should last for the day or at least a few rounds of drinks. If you're at a larger resort, sometimes they'll have small shuttles or golf carts to help get you around. Generally about 20 pesos is good for this. And for bell service or luggage staff, if you get help with your bags to your room, about 20 to 50 pesos, maybe a little more if you're a larger family or group with a lot of bags. Now, what currency? The biggest question I always see is what currency should you tip in? Well, if you're traveling to Mexico, the answer is pesos. But there are some considerations. First, pesos are more appreciated since it's just easier for the staff to use their local currency. However, if you're from the US and you're traveling to an all-inclusive resort and you have no plans to leave the resort, you're likely fine just bringing dollars. Just make sure you have lots of small bills, like ones, fives, some tens, and maybe a few 20s. If you're planning to stay more within a city, check into an Airbnb or a hotel and visit local restaurants, I would recommend getting pesos to use for tipping. I recently posted a video that covers everything about using pesos in Mexico for more details. I have heard some people bring a bit of both and ask which currency each staff member would prefer to be tipped in, so that could be an option to consider as well. Another small thing to think about is that the newer peso bills are waterproof, so if you're hanging in or around the pool all day, you don't need to worry about your bills getting soggy. And you can keep them in your swimsuit if you have pockets, and you don't have to worry about stashing your pesos away on the lounger if you're not watching it. Another thing to think about is the exchange rate, which is always changing. If you last traveled to Mexico, say 10 years ago, many staff probably did prefer tips in USD because the exchange rate was much more favorable. Now, with the peso being stronger, the US dollar doesn't go quite as far. A final note on this is that someone will always be appreciative of a tip. So even if you do provide it in USD, they're certainly not going to refuse it. Whether you think they prefer it over pesos, I'll leave that up to you to decide. At the end of the day, tipping is a personal decision and an expression of gratitude. You decide how much to tip with whatever you're comfortable with. I hope this video helped clear a few things up. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.